Appreciate your coming out here and that we could get this good of a turnout while competing with the National Men's Basketball Championship. We have here today speakers from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund based in Pennsylvania. We have Thomas Lindsay and Mari McGill. And Thomas is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. It's a nonprofit law firm that provides free and affordable legal services to community groups in over 300 local governments. He's a graduate of Widener University Law School in Harrisburg and is a 3-time recipient of the school's Public Interest Law Award, a 2003 recipient of the Law School's Young Alumni Award, and a finalist in the Ford Foundation's Leadership for Change World Award in 2004, and I could go on and on. He's got an amazing resume. Tom served as coordinator of the Franklin County Coalition, an association of 21 community groups in over 30 localities. Over 30 locally owned businesses are also involved. He's recently delivered speeches to the Bioneers Conference in California. Some of you may have seen him there, and to the National Network of Grant Makers Conference in Maine. He is a co-founder with Richard Grossman of the Democracy School, which is, I hear, coming to Missoula soon, and assists groups and communities to reframe single environmental issue campaigns into ones focusing more on the ability of community rights to trump corporate rights. And Mari McGill is the Associate Director of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and she's involved with the campaign organizing strategy and leads the organization's fundraising efforts. She recently returned from Ecuador, where she has advised the country's Constitutional Assembly in rewriting their constitution. She opened the Legal Defense Fund's West Coast office in Portland, Oregon recently, and was the director of corporate transformation for Corporate Ethics International, conducting corporate accountability campaigns targeting multinational big box retailers. Previously, she headed up the staff of the Oregon Sierra Club chapter and was an internal labor organizer for the Oregon Nurses Association. She serves as the political research director for the U.S. House of Representatives member David Wu on his successful 2004 re-election campaign, and has consulted with Forest Ethics and NARAL Pro-Choice Oregon. She received her master's degree in public policy and urban planning from Harvard University and John F. Kennedy School of Government. Today their lecture or talk is titled Asserting the Rights of Communities and Nature over the, quote, rights of corporations. And we're really delighted to have them here. They're doing some of the best public interest law and community organizing work in the country. Please join me in welcoming both of our speakers.
Thank you, Robin. We're going to do something a little unconventional to start out with, which is actually to go around and for folks to introduce yourself and essentially answer the question of why you came tonight, because we like to customize these talks, actually. We have stock speeches, but we found them kind of boring, and so we want to talk about the organizing that's important to you. So let's start up here, and then we'll go around the room.
I'm Allie Solomon, and I came tonight because I have a coworker who told me that when she heard you speak that you made her cry. Because you were so inspiring, and I had to hear it for myself.
Okay.
I expected a lot.
My name is Jamie Silverberger, and I also came for the same reason our coworker recommended.
And the coworker was in a school? Or,
I'm Erin's also prior.
Oh.
I was at the Pioneers in Bozeman and saw you speak through the satellite feed.
That was 2006?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
So I was really inspired, and I actually came in probably halfway through that presentation and didn't get to see the whole thing. So since then, I've been wondering what's going on, and I am just inspired to find out how to take our rights back from corporations and pissed off and ready to figure out how you do this. So
Great.
thank you.
My name is Vin D'Angelo. I'm a master's student here in the Environmental Studies program. I've just heard great things as well, and although I'm kind of more of a science student, this kind of stuff has definitely interested me. And I don't get enough of it, really. You know, I mean, I'll have enough time to take maybe one class on it, but I think, you know, I definitely get more out of hearing people talk who are involved with it and do it every day. So that's why I came.
Great. All right.
My name's Martha Noel, and I got an email last night about it. I've never heard of you before, but I believe that the rights of corporations is probably the key issue to all the things that I think should be different in the world.
Great.
My name is Anja Heister. I'm the Executive Director of Footloose Montana. We are an organization that educates the public about dangers of traps on public land. And I would like to get some inspiration. And I've heard good things about you both.
I'm Heather Jones. I'm here. I have to be, so I'm a grad student. And I have to be. But also, I really, I heard the title and I was like, oh yeah, I have to go to that. Anyway, we're asserting rights of community and nature together. You don't see that very often. It's either like community or just nature, and I like the two together because they're kind of related against corporations. So that sounds intriguing.
Ben?
Mike Kubig, I'm an EVSG graduate student in environmental policy, and I saw these two folks speak earlier today and came back for more.
He's a glutton.
I'm Riley Schwan, I'm the Executive Director of the Bioenergy Institute, and I also teach part-time in the Environmental Studies program. And I saw you talk at Pioneers, and I thought your presentation was one of the most profound and important presentations I've ever seen. And the corporate rights issue is one of those burrs in my butt that keeps bugging me.
Dan Browder, I'm a 2007 graduate from the law school here at University of Montana, and I'm interested in the whole personhood of corporations. The whole one side they have shareholders have no liability, on the other side they get personhood. It seems like sort of a little sleight of hand that happened in history that sort of has directed society, American society anyway, ever since.
My name is Michelle Walters. I also saw Tom at the Pioneers Conference. I think it was in 2006, and was very inspired as well by what he had to say. And I actually went to Pennsylvania as soon as I could to attend a democracy school. And upon coming back from Missoula, you know, basically quit my job to kind of devote myself full time to this work that I feel is vitally important for the future of this planet and every individual and every animal and ecosystem that is here. So I'd love to talk to anyone afterward about signing up. I am trying to host a democracy school here somewhere in Montana, definitely in the Missoula community. I think it'd be really important. And that is something that I've been trying to do, and just really, really looking forward to anyone who's definitely committed and interested in coming to democracy school, talking to them in this community, getting your information, and so we can keep in touch. And when we get enough people on board, we can see this thing through.
Luke Orsborn, and Michelle's my girlfriend, so aside from that, though, I'm also here because I'm concerned about all these issues and just a lot of reflection that we've been doing and stuff about the state of affairs in the world and how the richest nation is affecting not only people here but people globally and what role corporations have to play in that. So.
Great. Let's start up here.
I'm Jill Davies. I'm the Director of Sustainable Living Systems down in Bitterroot. Our focus is to build a local food system to take the food dollar away from the industrial agriculture. I saw you speak in 2006 Pioneers, and it knocked my socks off. And
between community, which I think is important, and corporations, which I think are much less important in my mind, although they sure have a big damn footprint, and I would like to sense some way to improve the balance between those.
I think they're connected because communities are stopped from doing certain things because of the corporate stuff. So I think they're intertwined.
Janice Cooper, also from down the Bitterroot, and I'm going to be working with Jill on the same project through the summer probably, so I'm just here to learn as much as I can.
Okay, start over here.
I'm not a name, I'm just a real concerned citizen, and I'd like to know more effective about environmental issues.
I'm Tim Skutka. I'm on the Missoula City and County Planning Board. And there's a corporation that has huge effects on our planning of this community, and we came to see what we can do with it.
I'm Patricia Hogan, and I'm just a garden variety citizen, but anything that even hints of revoking corporate personhood draws me in on this track of me, because I consider that number one on the list of the top 3 things that we need to do in this country.
I'm Helen Louise Dupuy, and I teach shamanistic workshops on nature and spirit, and I'm very interested in environmental policy and want to see the corporation lose a little power.
Okay.
My name is Panya. I am environmental studies major. I heard about this talk through one of my instructors, so I just come out and check it out.
Great.
My name is Stacy Bone. I'm a student in the Environmental Studies and Political Science Department on campus, and I'm really focusing my education on getting people connected to their environments and their political systems and working those two together. So.
Okay.
Todd Sprague, just read about the paper and thought it sounded interesting. So, thanks, so.
Good, welcome.
I'm multiple and communication major, and I came here because this lecture is one of the extra credit opportunity for my class.
My name is Clay, and I just came to this out of interest.
Great. So, welcome, and this is us. Organization that we work for is called CELDEF. We usually spell it out because it's such a mouthful. The Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and this is a webpage which we actually forgot to put up for the class that we taught earlier today. We usually teach things called democracy schools, as Michelle mentioned. They're 3-day training sessions for communities under siege by certain corporate assaults. So, for example, a community that's fighting Walmart Corporation from coming in, or a toxic waste incinerator, or a 5,000, 10,000, bless you, 5,000 or 10,000 head hog factory farm coming into a community. That we offer these training schools for those folks in the community because we think our existing system of environmental protection has not worked. And we're going to explain more about that in a couple minutes. For this crew, in the class this afternoon, we went all the way back to 95 when we were created and went through a lot of our work in the early days. I'm going to skip that and actually move up to 98 when our work started to change in terms of environmental protection work that we were doing. And I'm going to turn it over to Mari, who just got back from Ecuador, where we are assisting some folks in Ecuador with the rewrite of their national constitution on some issues. Folks in Ecuador heard about our work in the United States and asked us to come down to actually assist them with the rewrite of parts of their constitution. She's going to talk about that, which involves something called the rights of nature, which is the most cutting edge work that we do. So what happened back in 1998? Well, we started off as a garden variety environmental law organization whose job was really to assist communities with permit appeals and maneuvering their way through regulatory agencies, essentially becoming experts on environmental regulations and existing environmental laws in this country, and then assisting communities to weave their way through it. In 1998, something happened that changed the work that we did for the Legal Defense Fund. It is that work that is the most interesting work. If we had just kept doing run-of-the-mill traditional conventional environmental law work, we wouldn't be in Missoula right now because that wouldn't have gotten us to a stage where we had begun to spread this work out to other places. We now teach these democracy schools in 24 states. It still floors me to think about it, but this work, which essentially began in 98, this different kind of work that I'm going to talk about, essentially propelled these democracy schools, these 3-day training sessions, all across the United States. We've done 170 of them so far. We've graduated about 300 people through them. So, 3,000 attendees through the democracy schools. Those 3,000 attendees are now back in their communities, also doing this different kind of work. So in 1998, what happened? Well, our phones started ringing off the hook back in our Pennsylvania office, because that's where our headquarters are for Legal Defense Funds, Pennsylvania. And the calls that we were getting in 1998 were from rural municipal governments in the state of Pennsylvania who were being assaulted by agribusiness corporations. Agribusiness corporations who had been driven out of North Carolina and South Carolina between 1996 and 1998 were looking for a new home to put these things called factory farms. Not sure about how many people know what factory farms are, have seen them. Essentially, in the United States today, we're undergoing, and it's almost complete, what we would call a corporatization of agriculture, in which a very small handful of agribusiness corporations now controls most of the food production that we do in the United States. Just looking at pork, for example, we have 4 corporations, 4 agribusiness corporations that control 70% of pork production in the United States today. We have 5 corporations that control 60% of chicken production in the United States. We have 1 corporation, Kraft Foods Corporation, which controls 60% of cheese production in the United States. So we have what the Legal Defense Fund characterizes as a corporatization of agriculture, essentially eliminating once independent family farmers in the United States and replacing them with a food production system in which a very small number of corporations is making decisions about what we eat. That conversion process, that transformation, has had a deep impact on rural cultures that have been supported since the beginning of the United States by independent family farm units. In the United States, we've lost 300,000 farmers over the past 20 years. We always use the passive word lost, as if we can't find them somewhere. But those folks have been eliminated. They've been eliminated by this corporatization process, which through assembly line livestock production has undercut and undersold what independent family farmers can make from the marketplace. In Pennsylvania alone, we've lost 1,500 once independent livestock producers over the past 15 years. The statistic that we talked about in class today for the 4-hour presentation is that suicide among farmers is now the #1 cause of death for farmers in the United States, surpassing equipment-related deaths 2 years ago as the #1 cause of death for farmers. And so what we see is not just a change in livestock production or agricultural processes. It's actually about a stripping of power and authority from communities to decide what farming that they want within their community, and a transformation, a transferal of that authority and decision-making power to a small handful of people who are aligned in making decisions on behalf of the largest agribusiness corporations in the United States. Because of that, 2 of the 4 corporations, Hatfield Foods Corporation and Smithfield Foods Corporation, who have been active in North Carolina and South Carolina for many years, leading up to 1996 and 1997. If people remember, back in that period of time, a hurricane came through North Carolina and South Carolina, essentially wiped out most of the concentrated animal feeding operations, these huge CAFO factory farm operations that house 15,000 to 25,000 animals inside these football field aluminum cladded buildings. That the hurricane came through and knocked out those buildings, but more importantly, uncapped all the liquid manure lagoons that were next to these factory farm facilities. For folks that aren't familiar with the way that livestock is raised in that capacity, you generally have the big buildings that house the animals and then a huge, sometimes Olympic-sized swimming pool filled with liquid manure, because that's what the hogs produce. And it's contained in these huge pits. Hurricane that came through uncapped all those pits, and all the waste ran off the coast, North Carolina coast primarily, creating a dead zone off the coast of North Carolina, a biologically dead zone. Some of the great pictures that came out were, thousands of dead hogs floating down these rivers of waste off into the coast. And it's funny because we call these things lagoons, these liquid manure holding facilities. I had one of my friends sent me an email saying, I can remember when lagoons meant, bikini-clad women and little umbrellas and drinks. But now we call the liquid manure things lagoons. Anyway, Hatfield Foods and Smithfield Foods Corporation decided after that happened with the hurricane, and the North Carolina legislature put a moratorium in place for all new expansions of factory farms in the state, that the corporations decided to move someplace else to expand. And the place they ended up was rural Pennsylvania. Rural Pennsylvania is an interesting place. Pennsylvania is broken up into 1,400 units of government called township governments. They're the smallest units in the state of Pennsylvania. They're governed by 3-member boards of township supervisors. The township supervisors, their primary job is to take care of the roads. It's to plow the roads in the wintertime, patch the roads in the summertime. That's their primary job. Rural Pennsylvania, and I can tell this joke because I was born in Alabama. Essentially in Pennsylvania, we have Pittsburgh on one side of the state, Philadelphia on the other, and Mississippi in the middle. Just to give you an idea of what kind of culture operates in rural Pennsylvania. This is Republican, conservative, National Rifle Association membership, shit kicker boots, belt buckles that would make a Texan proud, as one of my lawyer friends likes to say about rural Pennsylvania. That Hatfield Foods and Smithfield Foods Corporation decided to come in to that area of Pennsylvania to put in 5,000 to 10,000 head hog factory farms, essentially to expand their operations, which they could not do in North Carolina up to that point. The problem was in rural Pennsylvania is that people in rural Pennsylvania didn't like factory farms. In fact, 400 of those municipal governments in the rural parts of the state had passed very strict local laws that very stringently regulated how liquid manure could be applied to land. So in essence, these ordinances acted as bans of sorts because they made it so expensive, because essentially if you put a factory farm in, and not to get into the mechanics or economics of actually hauling liquid manure, which we at one point in the office came to know quite a bit about, it's very expensive to haul liquid manure to other places. And so these ordinances, which set up a very stringent regulation of manure being applied to ground, essentially made it too expensive for these factory farm operators to put these 5,000 to 10,000 head hog facilities in. So, just like what happens in the United States every week, every day, every month, is that the corporations went to the Pennsylvania legislature. And they went to the Pennsylvania legislature with a bill that they had drafted that they hoped would become law. The bill that they drafted was called the Nutrient Management Act. I'll write that up here. Nutrient Management Act. It's a great name. What did the Nutrient Management Act do? Well, ostensibly it sought to regulate the amount of liquid manure that could be put on an acre of ground statewide. It's a planning law which sought to eliminate excess application of liquid manure onto the ground. What else did the law do? Well, it contained a preemption provision in it that preempted all 400 local governments in rural Pennsylvania from enforcing the ordinances that they already had on the books. Okay? So just to pause for a moment. We have the agribusiness corporations coming in. They meet a structure of law in these 400 municipalities. And that structure of law, in effect, acts as a ban for them putting the facilities in. They take a step back. They draft this new law called the Nutrient Management Act, which, lo and behold, has a provision in it that preempts, in other words, prohibits the local governments from enforcing or passing ordinances that regulate manure at the local level. It's called the Nutrient Management Act. What's funny about this thing, and I still remember it going through the legislature, is that it passed through with nary an opposing vote in the legislature. It was written by the Agribusiness Corporation and handed off to the House and Senate Ag Committees, because that's how law gets made in these United States today. It's rarely us getting things through the legislative process, but instead is things being handed off by the boys that would benefit from the bills going through. And at the signing ceremony, there was the governor. He signed the bill into law, and behind him were the agribusiness corporate representatives. You would expect them to be there. But off to the left was the environmental organizations, major environmental groups in the state. It really puzzled me for a while. And then it started to make sense because we started having some problems with the environmental organizations in Pennsylvania when we started doing a different kind of work. But suffice it to say, the environmental groups were there because they saw that it was a good thing that the state was stepping in so we wouldn't have this patchwork of different ordinances regulating manure in different places, but instead we would consolidate a law at the state level, even though the Nutrient Management Act was weaker than most of the ordinances that were in place in these 400 local governments, that the environmental groups had gotten behind the passage of this thing, and that's why there was nary a vote against it in the legislature. Imagine yourself as an elected official in these municipalities, these rural municipalities. You have responded to your residents because residents of rural Pennsylvania didn't want factory farms coming in. In fact, if you own a house within a quarter of a mile of one of these factory farms coming into the municipality, you lose 60% of your property value overnight by having this thing sited within a quarter of a mile. Folks in rural Pennsylvania had worked with their local elected officials to pass these ordinances. State legislature had stepped in at the behest of the agribusiness corporations to preempt the ordinances. And now those rural municipal elected officials, put yourself in that position, were caught in a vice. They would turn to their lawyers and they'd say to their lawyer, well, we have to do something here. Why can't we enforce our laws? It doesn't seem fair that the agribusiness lobby has got this law that has now overridden our local ordinances and we can't do anything. And the lawyer, uniformly in these 400 municipalities, would look back at the elected officials and say, well, the law is the law is the law. And we live in a federal system, damn it. And the federal system says the state trumps the local. The state has passed a law, so you as a locality, you can't do anything about it now. In fact, you can't control these factory farms coming in. The residents were on the other side of the vice, screaming at their elected officials to do something locally. And so these elected officials are caught in a vice. That's why they were calling us. And it wasn't one municipality calling or 10 or 20, it was 400 that eventually called our office for help. Now, the Nutrient Management Act sets up a process where a permit is necessary to site a factory farm. And that permit only looks at one thing, which is poop. So the amount of poop that you can put per acre. That's essentially how the regulations are written. So we had these people in rural Pennsylvania who were concerned about all kinds of things. We had farmers concerned about being put out of business, so you had the economic injury that was being caused. You had a cultural injury. There's statistics out. Concentrated ag, corporatization of ag really hurts rural economies. There's the farm implement dealers go out of business. And the other local businesses that are supported by independent farming industries are now no longer there. So there's all these problems, economic and cultural. There's also something called democratic damage. When 4 agribusiness corporations control 70% of pork production, it doesn't take the new math to understand who's actually writing ag bills. Because if you have that much economic power held by so few actors, that they begin to control the legislature as well. So all these different problems, economic, cultural, environmental with the odor pollution, air pollution, all those things, very complex problems floating around out there when you extinguish independent family farmers and replace them with a handful of agribusiness corporations. What the state said through the passage of the Nutrient Management Act is that there's no concerns here except for poop, right? So they redefined the problem. It's not the community's framing of the problem anymore as a complex issue. It is the corporations and the legislature's framing as a manure issue. That's it. So if you're in a community and you appeal a permit, this is all you can talk about. You can't go in front of the judge and say, Your Honor, I'd like to talk about suicide rates for farmers in the United States. He says, shut up and sit down, because we're here to talk about poop. You can't talk about economics. You can't talk about the 300,000 farmers. You can't talk about those things in these fora, because all you can talk about is manure and the disposal of manure upon land. I've actually watched this happen. It's fascinating. The Sierra Club in Pennsylvania actually provides lawyers to communities to actually go through these arguments, go through these permit appeals. And so you have the Sierra Club hiring their poop experts, and you have the agribusiness corporations hiring their poop experts, and they have a poop argument, and then the judge issues a poop decision. And most of the decisions coming out of Pennsylvania are poop decisions in the state. And so we had a choice. We could have done this. Could have become poop lawyers. And we decided not to. Instead, we said, there's something more basic operating here, which is that it's not in our best interest or the rural community's best interest to actually not have control over who's defining farming within their jurisdiction. And so we began to do some research about how other communities had done this work. Pennsylvania, we have 10,000 head hog factory farms. Those are boutique factory farms compared to what they have in the Midwest, where they have 500,000 head hog factory farms and 700,000 head hog factory farms. And now in the Midwest, they have 5 million chicken broiler operations. In Pennsylvania, they're now introducing the first 2 million chicken broiler operations. So there are amazing facilities that are now going in to further consolidate the ag industry. The dairy industry, the big dairy corporations, they have a plan for you folks. And the plan is to get rid of all the independent dairy farmers and put in 8 spokes. They call them spokes. These huge production facilities of 2 million, 3 million dairy animals stuffed into 8 concentrated areas. That's their dream about how they're going to produce milk over the next 50 years, which means getting rid of all the dairy farmers. And the funny part, it's not funny, it's tragic, but the interesting thing is none of it's a secret. You know, they have the plans, and you can actually read them, because this is how they see the transition and restructuring of the ag industry. None of this is under the covers, it's all out there. And so we thought it wasn't, you know, to have that much power concentrated in a few hands is not really the best way to have majority decision-making control over anything. And so we did some research on the issue, and sure enough, in the Midwest, where you would expect something to have happened because the facilities are 10 times as large as what's happening in Pennsylvania, that something interesting had happened over the last 100 years. And that is that the communities in 9 Midwestern states, the states themselves, people in those communities, had actually passed laws at the state level, not about poop or about air pollution or odor pollution or those types of things, but about agribusiness corporations. That 9 states in the Midwest, starting with Oklahoma in 1909, ending with Nebraska and South Dakota in the late 1990s, have adopted statewide laws that ban agribusiness corporations from farming. That ban agribusiness corporations from engaging in farming. Because folks in those states said it's not about parts per million or air pollution or odor pollution or these regulatory issues that we tend to spend all of our time on within environmental circles. It's actually a more basic question, which is, who decides? Who decides what farming is going to look like in a community? Is it going to be the majority of people who live in the community? Or is it going to be 6 people ensconced within the board of directors of a corporation located 1,000 miles from where the community is going to be? That's the question. It doesn't come down to any of these details. Most of these are all details. Because when you use the word regulate, when we talk about regulating something, regulate is a verb that assumes something already has come in. Because to regulate something, it has to be an ongoing operation. We're not talking anymore about yes or no for a community to agree to host something or not, or have something to come in. All we're talking about at that point when we talk about the word regulate is regulating it once it's here. And that is a stripping of our sovereignty to actually say yes or no to something coming in. So to us, it all comes down to this. Who decides what farming is going to look like in a particular area? And these 9 Midwestern states, folks in those 9 states, decided that they were going to be the ones to define what farming looked like in those particular states. And so they set about passing these laws that ban corporations from farming within those states. And the folks in Nebraska and South Dakota said it's not enough to drive those laws into law by statute, in other words, the normal way to put something on the books. But the folks in Nebraska and South Dakota in the late 1990s put the law into their state constitutions. They passed constitutional amendments to drive the anti-corporate farming laws into their state constitutions. Pretty big stuff. What did we do? Well, we stole the South Dakota law. We had no pride of authorship. We went in and we clipped it, cut and pasted it, and brought it back to Pennsylvania. And just to be a pain in the ass, we put a citizen suit provision in, which allows citizens in the community to sue to enforce the law if the elected officials don't. That law went into Pennsylvania, was circulated, has now been passed by 12 municipalities in 5 counties, passing those laws banning corporations from farming. Shortly after we got involved in the agribusiness issue, we got involved in the sludge issue. Short primer on sludge. Sludge is everything that goes down the toilet or down the sink in an area that's hooked up to a centralized sewage treatment plant. That's what sludge is, also known as sewage sludge. What can sludge contain? Up to 400,000 different toxic contaminants. The waste stream is fed by commercial, industrial facilities, everything you can imagine. How many do the regulatory agencies require testing for of the 400,000 different toxic contaminants? The answer is 11 of the 400,000 contaminants. We used to dump our sewage sludge into the ocean. I was still amazed on a recent trip to learn that they still do it in Anchorage. They still dump it in the ocean. We used to dump it off the coast of New Jersey. That's how we got rid of our sewage sludge. Once again, it doesn't take the new math to understand, but when you dump crap into the ocean, that it creates a biologically dead zone off the coast. That's what happened off the coast of New Jersey. So the folks, the brain surgeons that gave us ocean dumping of sewage sludge, then came up with a new plan. And the new plan was to land apply sewage sludge onto cropland where we grow our food. 60% of all sewage sludge produced in sewage treatment plants is now shipped to farmland, where it's applied to farmland where we grow our crops for food. Doesn't seem like the smartest idea, but that's how we do it. And Cornell University's Waste Management Institute tracks 350 cases across the United States of alleged death or injury due to people that have come into contact with sewage sludge, mostly immunocompromised individuals, elderly and youth. Pennsylvania, we've had 2 kids die after coming into contact with land-applied sewage sludge. One of those individuals, Danny Pennock from Berks County, Pennsylvania, is who we named the Democracy School after. It's known as the Daniel Pennock Democracy School. Danny was a healthy teenager playing basketball next to a sludge field one day. 72 hours later, he was sick with a Staphylococcus aureus infection. 72 hours after that, his lungs had been eaten out and he died in the hospital in Berks County. Tony Bahun was another child in Pennsylvania who died after coming into contact with land-applied sewage sludge. A lot of communities in Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania, didn't want to be on the receiving end of Philadelphia crap. To be more specific, they said we don't want to be crapped on by New York City or Philadelphia. And so we don't want sludge, and they were talking to us on the phone, they said, well, we've heard about what you folks had done with factory farms, and we'd like you to apply that to sludge. Can you draft us an anti-corporate sludging ordinance? And we said yes. And so first 1 passed it, then 10, then 20. We're up to 78 municipalities and 9 counties that have passed those laws. So in Pennsylvania at this point, we have over 100 communities, about 300,000 people that are living underneath those new ordinance frameworks in the state of Pennsylvania. And as we give these talks, generally the next segment is that as everybody knows, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And when you're dealing with the largest agribusiness corporations and largest waste corporations in the world, the reaction is apt not to be equal, but to be quite unequal. And so what happened next in Pennsylvania was that the agribusiness corporations began a 5-year process of attempting to pass legislation at the state level that would overturn these ordinances that communities had adopted. For 5 years, we fought off the legislation with a coalition of municipal governments, organized labor, environmental organizations, and farm groups. A liberal, progressive governor got elected in Pennsylvania, who was once mayor of Philadelphia. His name is Ed Rendell. He used to head up the Democratic National Committee as well. And Eddie Rendell managed to pass a bill 2 years ago called ACRE, stands for Agriculture, Communities, and Rural Environment, which now in Pennsylvania takes the state attorney general's office and authorizes the state attorney general's office to sue the municipal governments that have passed these ordinances to overturn them. Okay? So just to pause for a moment, because we've thrown a lot out to you in a relatively short period of time, is that in Pennsylvania, the law of the land is now that agribusiness and sludge corporations don't have to hire their own lawyers. They don't have to pay for their own lawyers. That's so passé. For them to have to hire their own legal help to sue municipalities to try to overturn these ordinances. The state of Pennsylvania has so generously put at their disposal now the Attorney General's office, taxpayer-supported Attorney General's office, as the private attorney for the agribusiness and sludge corporations in the state of Pennsylvania, to bring suit against the municipalities to try to overturn the ordinances that they've adopted. First 5 lawsuits were filed earlier this year against municipalities. And the situation in Pennsylvania is a very interesting one because the work of these municipalities has produced this response from the Attorney General's office. We've been selected as legal counsel to defend one of the municipalities that has been sued. But one thing we talk about in these 3-day democracy schools is a real question that draws discussion, conversation, and debate, which is we put out the proposition after doing this work for 13 years now. My opinion is that we don't live in a democracy at this point, that we live in something much different. And my conclusion is that we live in something that looks something like this. A corporate state. That's what I think. I think that when you're in communities that are not allowed to make certain decisions about what their community is going to look like in 20, 40, or 60 years, that regardless of the IV drip that's been put in our arms since birth, about how this country has the greatest democracy and the greatest plan of governance and the founding fathers were the greatest people that ever walked this planet, that there's something not right with the structure of government and law that doesn't allow communities to actually determine their own fate. What's fascinating to me about these ordinances is that when we first started doing the ordinances, first started drafting them, we would caution and counsel municipal governments that we live in a system where corporations have constitutional rights. We have this nasty little secret in the law, lawyers all know it, so it's not a secret to them, that corporations under our structure of law are actually treated as persons for purposes of the Constitution. So whereas you and I have First Amendment rights and Fourth Amendment rights and 14th Amendment rights, that corporations have those same rights. And it's a case law that developed after the Civil War. Courts judicially conferred certain constitutional rights onto corporations. In the early days of doing this work back in 2000, 2001, we had a couple lawsuits, not from the Attorney General because that law hadn't passed yet, but by corporations, agribusiness corporations, who attempted to overturn some of the anti-corporate farming laws. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but suffice it to say, the anti-corporate farming laws distinguish between family farmers and corporate farmers. That's what they do. They try to ban corporate farming and support independent family farms. Well, it turns out that in the U.S. Constitution, under the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, there's a little thing called the Equal Protection Clause, which says that law shall not be applied differently to classes of persons. Well, the anti-corporate farming law that we passed obviously does that on its face, and it drew a lawsuit from the corporations. Page 1 of the lawsuit was, we are agribusiness corporations, we are persons under the law, therefore we have constitutional rights, and your ordinance, your local law that distinguishes between corporate farms and family farms, violates our corporate constitutional rights. So in other words, there's a limit, that seems, as to what we can do in our communities. As we were describing it this afternoon, it's like a box. And inside the box, we have what's called allowable activism, which is defined for us. If we step outside the box, we get smacked. And we get smacked because outside the box is this level of rights claimed by corporations that have been judicially conferred on them that actually control what we can do. One more example, because we're going pretty fast here, but state of Vermont passed a law back in the 1990s that required dairy corporations to label their products that contain BGH, bovine growth hormone, which is the artificial additive used to increase milk production. It's been banned in Europe. There's a bunch of other concerns about it. State of Vermont said, we're not going to ban BGH, we just want corporations to label it. So as consumers walking into stores, we know what we're putting into our bodies. The dairy industry sued through their trade association and contended that the labeling law violated the corporation's First Amendment right not to speak. Okay? With the First Amendment, you have a right to speak, but you also have a right not to be compelled to speak. That's First Amendment coverage. Corporations as persons have First Amendment rights. They sued, contending that the labeling law violated their right not to speak. Federal judge agreed and threw out the labeling law. Okay. In the democracy schools, we trace corporate rights through the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment, stuff that would make your toes curl, probably, decisions over the years. But in essence, we're stuck here because we're told that there are some private decisions that are made outside that we can't touch, but that we have an allowable box of activism into which we can work. Pennsylvania and some of these other places, they've decided that that allowable activism guarantees that their community gets screwed. And so people are starting to work outside of that box. We talked a lot about Pennsylvania tonight. Pennsylvania is where everything started, I think. One of the reporters who was covering it called it the Pennsylvania Revolt, because people in rural Pennsylvania are standing up and saying, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to be the dumping ground anymore. We're going to take action to stop it. And the folks that are doing this to us have names. There are names of people who are actually dumping this stuff in our communities. The work has since spread. In fact, since 2006, the work has spread quite a bit. In New Hampshire, a little town called Barnstead, New Hampshire. Small little community in New Hampshire. Nestle Corporation came next door, threatened to take out 300,000 gallons a day for a water bottling operation to sell bottled water in Europe, ship it to Europe. Folks in Barnstead said, we don't think that's such a good idea for Barnstead. We value our aquifer and we like to have our own drinking water. So they became the first municipality in the United States to pass a local law banning corporations from withdrawing water from their town. That has since spread from Barnstead to 2 other towns in the state of New Hampshire. In Virginia, just last month, a little town called Halifax. It happens to be a community next to the largest uranium deposit in the United States, in Virginia. Became the first municipality in Virginia to pass an ordinance along these lines, which not only dealt with these particular issues, but also, just like 24 other municipalities in Pennsylvania, ordinances that strip corporations of constitutional rights at the municipal level. In other words, they challenge the claim by corporations that they have constitutional rights at the municipal level, and those ordinances include that material. Folks have moved past ordinances in some of these places. They've upped the ante to do something called constitution making through the home rule provisions in their state. We're not going to go into detail on what home rule is, but suffice it to say, 48 states have home rule provisions which allow municipal governments, municipalities, to rewrite their municipal charter. Their municipal charter for a municipality is akin to a local constitution. The home rule provisions allow citizens of the community to come together, circulate a petition, and actually rewrite their charter for their municipality, therefore upping the ante from passing ordinances into passing constitutions. I have relocated to Spokane for 11 months to take over a project called Envision Spokane. Envision Spokane is an effort by citizen organizations in the city of Spokane to rewrite the city's home rule charter, to provide for rights for workers, communities, neighborhoods, and even the Spokane River, which is something that folks are talking about in Spokane. The home rule stuff is driven by a recognition by our communities that the existing structure of law places the rights of property and commerce above the rights of people, communities, and nature. That's what the structure of law does, because when we have allowable activism in a box and we can't exceed it, and we have to operate within existing contours, that the structure of law itself places certain values and interests over others, which results in some ways with the corporate rights stuff in corporations having more rights than the communities in which they do business. Okay? Because of that, some folks have determined that we need to change the structure of law from one in which property and commerce always trumps people, communities, and nature, and instead turn the equation upside down so that the right of people, communities, and nature actually trump the right of property and commerce at the local level. We think it's the beginning of a foundation for a movement of sorts that is not an environmental movement, but a democratic movement for democracy, to actually create democracy in places where we don't think it exists at this point. One of the most cutting-edge pieces of work that's being done through these communities is something called the rights of nature. We talked about this briefly in the 4-hour presentation that we did today. I'm going to turn it over to Mari so she can talk about the rights of nature, which is intertwined with our trip recently to Ecuador to assist those folks.
Hello. The rights of nature is a concept that I think Thomas is correct in saying that it's very cutting edge, it's very new, and something that really drew me to this organization. I've done quite a bit of environmental activism myself. I've worked for the Sierra Club in Oregon. As Robin mentioned, I've done other things, campaigning, initiative processes, and so forth, and was always frustrated by the outcomes that I found. Whether it was we were trying to elect the best of like the least of the evils, or we were trying to get a transparency law, for example, for pesticides. But when I really wanted to do was stop the damn pesticides. Those sorts of things. And I always felt very frustrated, and I felt we were often spinning our wheels. And I encountered the Legal Defense Fund's work when I was working with an organization called Corporate Ethics International, in which I was conducting corporate accountability campaigns, where you pressure corporations to ask them to try to change their ways, change their practices, whether they treat workers better, they provide higher wages, healthcare insurance, they cite their stores in places that they're wanted as opposed to not wanted. They conduct better environmental practices up and down their supply chain. And I moved to focusing on corporations because I was so frustrated by the political system and my environmental activism. And I thought, wow, taking on corporations through these campaigns, that will do it. That will do it. That will change the cards. And I found myself even more frustrated because trying to ask Walmart to do something good it's sort of, it's a drop in the bucket compared to their impacts, whether it be for workers or environment and so forth. And so I found this work to be very compelling because I found that it went right to the root causes of why corporations were able to have this power, why we were so frustrated in our environmental work. I've done labor work as well, and why we were so frustrated in those things. And so I finally found this organization that was working on root causes, and I think the rights of nature work gets to it the closest that I have found. And perhaps you'll find it compelling as well. There's a town in New Hampshire called Nottingham, and Thomas mentioned Bardstown, New Hampshire, which in 2006 we worked with them to help them draft and adopt the first in the nation ban on corporations being able to engage in these massive water withdrawals. A town not too far from Barnstead called Nottingham has spent the past 7 years fighting a company called the USA Springs Corporation who wanted to come in and withdraw upwards of 300,000 gallons of water a day from their local aquifer. And they've been fighting within the regulatory system, and they've been doing that by doing all of the right things that I have done. Perhaps you have done them as well. They've filed petitions, they've filed lawsuits, they've protested, they've held signs, they've organized their neighbors, they've done the outreach, they've got the websites and the newsletters, they've lobbied in their state legislature in New Hampshire. They've done all of these things, and they've spent quite a bit of money, thousands and thousands of dollars, to try to stop this thing from coming in. And for about 6 years, they did that work through the regulatory system, and I have to give them a tremendous amount of credit because they stuck with it. Most often community groups, after 1 or 2 years of this, if not a short period of time, just get exhausted because this can take over your lives. These people had put their lives on hold and have done it now for 7 years to try to stop this thing from coming in because they understood that they could not live in their community if there wasn't water there. Sort of a basic idea. And they saw the work that we had done with the community called Barnstead, which wasn't too far away in the state. And they had some folks come to a democracy school, and we talked with them, and we did a number of public presentations to talk to them about this work. One of the pieces of the work that we thought was particularly of interest to them, in addition to the idea of just passing an ordinance that would ban corporate water withdrawals, something critically important for them, and also necessarily stripping corporations of their constitutional rights. We think that's absolutely necessary because otherwise the corporation will come in and use those rights to overturn the ordinance. Another piece of this that was very important for the folks in Nottingham as well as well as some other communities that we've worked in, and increasingly in more and more communities that are reaching out to us, is this concept of rights for nature, in which they put into the ordinance in which they adopted in March, just last month, at their town meeting. And what it does is it recognizes nature as having legally enforceable rights to exist and flourish. Legally enforceable rights to exist and flourish. Coming out of the environmental community, that's something that we never ever talked about, the environment having rights. Nature, under our structure of law, is considered to be property. Considered to be property not unlike slaves were considered to be property under the law. It wasn't until we had the Civil War and drove in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments into our U.S. Constitution that African Americans in this country were recognized as people having rights under law. Until that time, they were property under the law, much like women were property under the law until we, through the suffragist movement, helped drive in the right to vote for women. We were property under the law. I'm happy not to be that anymore. And that meant that, for example, as we discussed earlier today, if a wife was raped, before women had rights under the law, if a woman was raped, her husband could claim damages, and the funds would go to him because the wife was property, his property, and had been damaged through a rape. Just to give you an example. Slaves, and this is, I'm sure we all know that slaves could be killed by their owners, their masters. They could be whipped, they could be dismembered, any number of incredible violations. None of that was illegal. In fact, it was legal because they were property under the law. And so we saw in these people's movements, whether it be the abolitionist movement, the women's movement, we've seen the labor movement, and others, that you take something that was considered privately held property, and under the law becoming through the people's movement and driving in this case in our country, driving in amendments to the Constitution that turned something that was property into something that is rights-bearing, people who are rights-bearing. And we're building on that work, and we talk a lot in the community, in the democracy schools about people's movements, past people's movements, both in this country and others, and how we are in fact sort of standing on their shoulders, learning from the work that they had done, and how long it took, often 30, 40 years or more, to drive these rights for people into the Constitution. And we're building on their work because we're now looking at nature, which is treated as property under the law. And we're facing, after 40 years of environmental regulatory law in this country, things are worse off than they were 40 years ago before we had these laws. We're facing global climate crisis, we're facing the collapsing of our fisheries and so on. And our environmental laws, which we consider so vaunted and so great, and which we're exporting to other countries, are not doing the job we think they need to do. I think that's what many of you expressed in this room when you introduced yourselves, that you're frustrated by that, as are we. And so the rights of nature, the idea of recognizing legally enforceable rights for nature means taking nature from being property under the law to being a rights-bearing entity. And we talk about it in terms of natural communities or in terms of ecosystems. And for the folks in Nottingham, this was very compelling for them as well, because they understood that if the USA Springs Corporation came in after they adopted this ordinance that we worked with them on, not only would the corporation be violating the ordinance and the people in it and their ability to enforce the ordinance, but also would be violating nature's rights as well. Violating nature's rights as well. And it was the work in Nottingham and in other communities that we've done, that we've worked with in the United States, on not only the corporate work, but also this idea of rights for nature, that really got the attention of people in Ecuador who are working to rewrite that country's constitution. And so in November and again in February of this year, we visited, we went to Quito, we went to Monte Cristi, where they're actually holding the Constitutional Convention, and we met with delegates, we met with NGOs, environmentalists in Ecuador, we met with academics, we met with lawyers. I think it's the conversations with the delegates who are the elected delegates, there's 130 of them from around the country, they include indigenous folks as well, who are working to write a new constitution. And Ecuador isn't a country that I knew very well before going there, but for those of you who don't know, they have, it's just a tremendously rich country in terms of its natural resources. I hate the word natural resources, but I think you all know what I mean when I say it. Oil, for example, and other resources there that are just so extraordinary, and they have just a climate and ecosystem that are just tremendous, as well as wildlife in the Amazon and so on. And they're doing something that we think is pretty incredible. We work here at the most local level because we don't think there's anywhere else to do this kind of work. And we get called in to assist the folks, the delegates, to their constitutional convention to start this at the national level in Ecuador, which is really extraordinary because they understand that it's multinational corporations that are coming in to their country, like Texaco and others who are extracting resources and damaging that environment and leaving that country, using it like a cheap hotel, really, is what they're doing. And it's multinational companies that come out of the United States in large part that are doing it, and yet they invited us in, and we constantly found ourselves sort of saying we're not representing our country, we're not representing our laws. In fact, we ourselves are butting heads with them because we raised some suspicion by being Americans and coming in and talking about environmental laws and so on. And it was a very, very interesting time. And so they asked us to draft language, and which we did, that would be that they're now considering putting into the draft constitution, which they'll vote on and approve in draft form, probably in June, I think is the current schedule. And that will go to the voters of Ecuador, the people of Ecuador, to vote on later this summer. The language that they asked us to draft, we built on very much from the ordinances that we've passed in places like Nottingham, and places like Halifax and Western Pennsylvania, rural central Pennsylvania, people who've understood that we don't have a democracy in this country, and who understand that in order to protect their communities, the people in those communities, as well as the environment, they have to take steps outside of this box that we talk about. And in fact, in many ways, turn their back on the regulatory system and a structure of law that doesn't allow them to protect these things. And so the people of Ecuador looked at this work and thought, the delegates, that this is very compelling to them because they, while their structure of law is based on Spanish law and ours is based on English law, it's very similar in that communities can't say no to corporations coming in and extracting their resources, violating their rivers and so on, as well as corporations, there as here, have constitutional rights. They have rights of persons, which the corporations are able to use to overturn any efforts to protect the environment, public health, and so on, just like happens here. And so they asked us to draft this language, and they actually took it a step further than we have done. We write into the ordinances that we develop with these communities legally enforceable rights of nature to exist and to flourish. And we thought that sort of was kitchen sink enough, that it captured enough that to protect the nature in those communities, whether they be waterways, rivers, streams, species, trees, whatever it might be. The people that we sat down with in Ecuador said, well, what if we said, put in recognize legally enforceable rights for nature to exist, to flourish, and to evolve. And they took it a whole step further. And I think they were absolutely right, and we readily agreed, and now we're incorporating that into our work here in the States. And it's just very fascinating because they understand, whereas our Constitution in this country creates a structure of law, a structure of government, they actually want to put this into their Constitution. They understand how so vital it is for their survival, how vital it is for their economy, how vital it is for them just as a country to protect nature, and they understand that under our existing kinds of environmental laws that we have, that we've now exported to Ecuador and to countries all over the world, that they can't actually protect nature in those places. We often talk about in the democracy schools how what our environmental laws really have done in this country is slow the rate of degradation of the environment. Rather than protecting the environment, sort of slowed the destruction. And the folks in Ecuador certainly understand this, and they don't want to put that into their constitution. They think that they understand there's something different that needs to happen. And so we met with a number of delegates. We met with the president of the Constitutional Assembly, and he said to us something that was really fascinating and which really struck right home with us, is that he said that he understood that under this structure of law, that nature is a slave. That nature is a slave. And it was something that we had never really heard out of the mouth of someone in such a place of authority. And it really touched our hearts and minds that he was able to say that right off the bat and really understood the way the structure of law worked. And he's actually started writing about rights of nature. And we're very hopeful that as the debate continues in this Constitutional Assembly, that they'll take this language, modify it as they need to. We sat there at a whiteboard actually in Quito our last night there. I have some Spanish fluent language. Thomas has even less. And we sat there trying to translate our English language that we had written for them into Spanish, which was very interesting, very difficult. And we're very hopeful, however, that the translation was correct, but also that they're going to actually be able to have the kind of debate that allows them to put their values into law in a way that we simply have not done in this country, that we just haven't done in this country, except in these few communities that we have now worked with who've adopted this language. They value nature so highly, and especially when we spoke with indigenous delegates who don't see themselves as separate and apart from nature in a way that we do. They understand that it's all part of a collective whole. And it's a value that they very much want to drive into their constitution, and we're very hopeful that that will happen. And I think that we've learned a great deal from them, and whether or not they actually move this forward, we certainly have had just an extraordinary experience and found that we learned a lot from them about how to communicate this, not just in Spanish, but how to communicate this, the culture and the values that they bring that we see in our rural communities, people who would not consider themselves environmentalists who are taking on this work. And we think that there's a lot of potential to take it elsewhere. We get calls from places like Australia. There's an interest right now in actually giving, I guess, personhood rights, they would call them, to whales in Australia, which is actually fascinating. The idea of giving whales legally recognized rights under law is something that fascinates us. It may sound sort of silly and crazy, but I think that's how this moves forward. We've had requests from places in Africa and South Africa, for example, and communities really across the country continue to contact us, and we think it's very inspiring to us, certainly. And I think with that, maybe we should wrap, because I know we're supposed to finish up around 9, and we wanted to offer an opportunity for Q&A and discussion, should there be some.
And just one question we left the class with this afternoon was, can we build environmentally and economically sustainable communities while operating within this box? And the answer that we've come up with, at least within the League of Council, is no. That in essence, this guarantees that we will not be able to, because when our efforts to create sustainable communities through law run up against corporate rights, it's corporate rights that trump these communities, because the communities don't have the lawmaking authority to do what they need to do. So today, because the conversation was focused on sustainability, that's one of the questions that we asked. Questions? Yes?
I'm just interested in your remark about the people in South America incorporating their values into the laws. And I wonder if you don't think that's part of the problem here, that those are our values, that we see stuff as resources, and that's maybe the first conversation we need to have is recognize that our values are changing.
Well, I think we talk, some of the people who were in the conversation earlier today, we dragged through the Constitution and looked at the language there and talked about, people always ask us, why is the system the way that it is? And I think we often say it's because it's working exactly as designed. Because our Constitution, based on English common law, really reflects the desire to excavate our resources and build an economy based on that. And certainly, I think those are the values, the idea of property and commerce. The word corporation doesn't show up in the Constitution, but certainly they gain a lot of rights and protections from it and are able to use it to forward this sort of progress. I would agree with you. I don't think that our laws now reflect our values. It's certainly not the values of the folks in this room, and not the values of the people that we meet in our communities. And I think that it's a very serious conversation to have. I think it's interesting too, though, that we work in communities that are some of the most rural and conservative, and the values aren't so environmental for them. I think it's very fair to say. It's that they're very much driven by the idea that they don't have the power that they thought they had. The democracy that they learned about in school, in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and all of these things, this thing that we hold up, the United States, as this beacon of democracy, and we shine our light around the world, is really something else entirely. And that is extremely, extremely disheartening for the people in these communities who would probably cringe if I called them environmentalists, although in some ways I think they're, if we were to reframe that word, are becoming the strongest environmentalists out there. And so I think it's really so much more than just the environment. I think it's very much about democracy, about who decides, because while we tend not to talk about it that way, initially when we go to a community that's facing something like a Walmart or a water withdrawal or a quarry or mining, it very quickly becomes much more than that single issue. It becomes a much bigger question about who decides. And so they understand that this is democracy work that they're doing. And I think that's the conversation that's starting to happen and needs to happen.
Plus, there's a myth, I think, that change occurs just because people are talking about it. That there's a very powerful grip on people's brains to think that we live in a democratic system. And so most of our activism follows from that assumption, which we think is mistaken. So people assume that we live in a democracy, and then they go out to use the tools that they have available to them while they assume that we live in a democratic system. The only way that we found that people relinquish that grip on this belief that we have a democratic system is when they come into conflict with, in our case, corporations on the ground. In other words, somebody wants to build something next to them, or somebody wants to assault something near them. And that's the only thing powerful enough to actually release the grip, because then people can see it actually happening in their community. And that's why we focus on place-based activism, because I don't think it happens any other way, especially with this stuff, because it's about smashing and smacking down that concept that we're in a structure that allows majorities to actually make decisions about their futures in 20, 40, or 60 years. The only thing I've seen that's powerful enough to do that is actually this confrontation that takes place in the community that actually proves to people that we don't live in what we think that we live in.
I wanted to say that what you're talking about is really encouraging, especially the idea that nature has rights. And what I teach is that everything is interconnected, sacred, and alive, and that means it has all things have energy or spiritual energy. And of course that's a native, indigenous.
Yes.
And I think the idea of changing the perception of how we view nature from a commodity to a sacred being is just right on. And I also appreciate your ideas of democracy and the corporate law and all of that, because you need both. You need the political as well as the idea of your changing your mental space of how you view nature. Nature is, like I said, it's interconnected, sacred, and alive. I really appreciate what you're doing.
I'd like to know a little more about what rights of nature would look like, really, because I'm just curious what that actually would look like in practice, or how that would work. Because it seems like it'd still take people to make those decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who represents nature?
Right, right. Who stands for trees? It's a really important discussion that we have with communities, and we do something interesting in the ordinances, which is, and I think Thomas mentioned it, but with the rights of nature, as with the ordinances overall, if the local government fails to enforce the ordinance, the rights for nature, the stripping of corporations of constitutional rights, the ban on the water withdrawal, or the quarry, or the mining, or whatever it might be, then people in that community have the legal right to enforce that law. And so what that means is the rights for nature, for example, meaning that, as with anything else that we do, when we enforce a law, I don't think it's terribly different in that we can create a system for how to enforce, and often what that includes is things like if a corporation suddenly comes in and starts, for example, in the town of Nottingham, starts withdrawing water, which they very much want to do, then the local government is charged with stopping them, and that could include an injunction or legal action of some kind. If the local government in Nottingham chooses not to take that action, the people in Nottingham, I can most assure you would take the matter into their own hands, meaning that they themselves would seek the injunction or would seek to stop through lawsuits or other means. And that's how enforcement would take place. not unlike any other enforcement of a local law that would go on.
Plus, just to be practical, just to look at two examples. Today, if a river is polluted, for example, let's say oil company is upstream, there's a spill and they pollute the river, that the folks wanting to get compensation from that act, let's say you're a fisherman and you go to the river weekly to fish and you catch 4 fish a month from the river. That right now, the legal system does not see the river as an entity. It doesn't exist in the courts. What does exist in the courts is you, who are coming in to ask the judge for compensation from your inability to now use the river to catch fish. So when you go into court to press your claim, the judge will pick up the phone, call the local fish market, and find out how much 4 fish a month would be in terms of compensation, and then compensate you for how much you've lost by not being able to exploit the river. These laws are different because they shift the inquiry, the focus, from the person that's using the river to the river itself. So to actually see this in action, we're about ready to bring a test case in Northeast Pennsylvania on one of these ordinances. But in essence, it means stepping into the shoes of the ecosystem. So for example, the case would no longer be styled as the fisherman versus the oil company. It would be the Willamette River versus Texaco. And the person walking into court to represent the ecosystem stands in the shoes of the ecosystem to seek damages for what's happened to the ecosystem itself. So when damages are assessed, they actually pay to bring the river back from where it was previously, from the pollution that had occurred in it, back to its previously undamaged state. Right now, the damage assessment that gets done by the court is not on the ecosystem itself. It's actually on the use of the ecosystem and how it's exploited. That's what the legal system sees, because nature is property. And so from a property perspective, it has no standing in the courts. These laws also do something else very interesting, which is eliminate the standing inquiry that takes place in the courts. Currently today, if you want to go in and get damages, you have to pass a filter in the courts that looks at whether you've had financial injury or not. These ordinances get rid of that standing requirement and allow anybody as a resident in a community to actually bring that suit to seek damages for the rights of the ecosystem. The more interesting question, at least to me, that some folks ask is why are rural communities, rural conservative Republican communities in rural parts of the country passing rights of nature ordinances, right? Because you wouldn't expect those communities to be the folks that are doing it. And the answer is fairly simple. It's very utilitarian, actually, which is that when a corporation comes in to assault a community, it's not just the rights of people that they're violating, like longwall coal mining in western Pennsylvania, where they take out the coal and then the land subsides and takes out the waterways. It's not just the people that are being impacted in their rights, it's also the ecosystems themselves. So you have the corporate assault coming in, and the last 40 years have proven that it's not enough to use our rights, or people's rights, communities' rights, to actually fend off the corporate assault. One thing we didn't talk about was today under our system of law, communities are unable to say no to anything that's been permitted by the state. So if the state agencies or other state entity has granted a permit to do a certain activity to the corporation, that communities are prohibited from saying no to the activity that permit now legalizes from the state. And so we're in a situation where we have found ourselves to not be enough to actually fend off the corporate assault. In these rural conservative communities, they're looking at building a new bastion of rights on behalf of nature and ecosystems, which recognize that not only do those ecosystems have rights, but those rights can be enforced by the people within the community. It actually makes the community stronger by being able to tap into a different reservoir of rights that actually mirrors the damage that the corporation is causing when it comes into a community, and actually makes the community stronger to fend off the corporations coming into the community. So from a utilitarian perspective, and what's interesting from this is that these communities pass these things, what we find is that their values start to shift. Because when you actually treat ecosystems as another bastion of rights, what you begin to do is value these ecosystems. That's what's happening in these communities. And so from this perspective, it makes sense what's happening in rural Pennsylvania and other places.
How does the theory of animal rights fit into your rights of nature concept?
We get asked those sorts of questions a lot. For example, I remember we were in, it was in Barnstead, New Hampshire. We were at a town select board meeting, and someone stood up and said, "Does this mean I can't shoot the squirrels in my yard?" My first thought is, why do you want to shoot the squirrels in your yard? But we write the language a bit broader than specific animal. We write about ecosystem and natural communities. Because it's not intended to stop hunting, for example. It's intended to stop the decimation of a waterway, for example, to actually be an ecosystem. It's intended to protect ecosystems from being completely wiped out, rather than focusing on specific individual animal rights, though it is a question that we often get asked about. The idea being that you can't wipe out a species. You can't wipe out a river. You can't wipe out an ecosystem where, as many of you have said, things are connected to one another. You can't wipe out something that's going to cause other things to get wiped out as well. And so that's how we write the language.
That's from another perspective, from a utilitarian sense, of course, it makes sense to our communities, but also one fact is clear. After 40 years of doing work through regulatory agencies and permit appeals and that kind of stuff, after 40 years, by almost every major environmental statistic, things are worse today than they were 40 years ago. And so our system of permit appeals and the regulatory stuff is not working. And so the question is, can we find another system that does? And one of the statements I usually make is that we've never had an environmental movement in this country. We've never had one, because the environmental movement has been focused on regulatory and permit issues, which is us chasing across the landscape to try to put out spot fires. But it's never been about rights. The abolitionists drove in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. They changed the Constitution. The suffragists changed the Constitution. They changed the frameworks of law by taking things that were once considered property and making them into rights-bearing entities. This is a la that same system, with an understanding that we will never be able to protect the natural environment unless we recognize certain rights on behalf of those ecosystems, of which we are a part, as much as we like to think that we are not. But until we accord the highest societal values to ecosystems and these natural communities, we will continue to lose them. And that's the situation we're stuck in now.
Most of the ordinances are municipalities. Do you ever work with a county?
That's a very good question. We're now breaching the county level in a couple places, but we're finding that the places where this work grounded the fastest was in small communities where we had face-to-face communication among neighbors and community members, and that enough communities have started to push into the county level. In other words, we now have enough communities who have passed ordinances and local laws to then push up into the county level, and eventually this has to push into the state level, and then it eventually has to push into the federal level. Because a lot of our folks have come to the conclusion that we actually have to change this federal structure of law, and that the only way this happens is through a grassroots movement that pushes up to redefine. What's fascinating about this work is these folks are in essence writing their own constitutions. They're an advanced glimpse of what is going to happen 30 years down the road, where these folks are actually going to drive into these different levels of government to begin to put their imprint on these different levels. So the reason why we don't work at the state level so much, I worked in the state legislature for a number of years, this is impossible in most places. And the federal is certainly impossible. And so this is where we concentrate our efforts right now.
That's what I was going to ask before, the charter, you were talking before that the cities, so the charter is at a city
It's
level.
also at the county level.
But how would that, like, if it gets appealed or fought to the state level or the federal level, how does it survive?
Well, in Spokane, let's take that for an example. We have a city charter in Spokane that folks in Spokane want to rewrite. There's also the county of Spokane that folks want to actually drive that language into eventually. The question you asked is about a corporate challenge that comes in. So, you know, what makes constitutions any different from ordinances in terms of corporate rights coming in? And the answer is it makes it more difficult to overturn it because we're working at a higher level. It's constitutional and not ordinance driven. So in different places that gives you different layers of protection. Like Colorado, there's actually an exemption that exempts them from state and federal law for real local control and home rule at the county level. But the other answer to that question is not so simple, which is that if we care enough about democracy and about rights of ourselves as well as protecting the natural communities, then can we step back while the corporations come in to overturn our constitutions once we've made a sacred pact? The Constitution is the highest lawmaking authority that we have. And the question is, what's next after this? And in Montana, this may not seem as scary as audiences I've talked to in Connecticut and Massachusetts, perhaps. But there are folks in Western Pennsylvania talking about leaving the state because they're saying to themselves, what good does it do if we are actually under a layer of government that does not allow us to build the types of sustainable communities we need to build? What is it to our benefit that we're actually still part of the state, for example? Or to take it to a higher level, part of the federal government, for example. All to say, I'm throwing that out for, it's a fairly controversial step, but throwing that out to say we need the steps after this, because otherwise we're screwed. Because if we know we can't build the type of place we need to build from a sustainability perspective in this box, yet we refuse to do activism outside the box, then we're screwed. And so we need other steps here, and part of the Democracy School, these 3-day trainings, actually exploring what that means.
Are you saying that in Western Pennsylvania they're talking about secession?
In Western Pennsylvania, they have us writing into some of the local constitutions a right of separation. That says that if corporate rights, illegitimate corporate rights, are used to overturn things that they've written into their constitution, that it gives them a right to further separate from the unit of government that originally brought that in the first place to preempt. And so people are thinking about what that means, because some people, I don't think we subscribe to this yet, or at least I don't, think that the United States is too big to be sustainable, and that's got to be broken into smaller bits. And so some of our folks are that far ahead thinking about what that means to this organizing form.
Folks, I think we're going to have to kind of wind it down. Do you want to take another question or two? Or
take one more question and then we'll go. You had another question? Let's do it.
So I work for a newly national organization that works on toxic chemical reform and issues, and I was really struck by your example of the labeling in Vermont, because we have a lot of our campaigns focused around labeling. And this is like turning my world on its head right now. And I'm sort of struggling to figure out how, as a national organization, we can work, given that the tools that you're saying have been utilized for the past 34 years are ineffective, and we're not working within communities that are dealing with a specific corporate threat. We're working with the 5 leading cleaning product manufacturers who are including chemicals that cause reproductive harm and asthma, and they're not labeling. And how do we change that? I'm just looking, I'm just curious, because we're sort of grappling with this. Do we go the route of individual participation and try to engage, because I work for a women's environmental health organization, and engage women on an individual level, or do we go more the policy route and try to affect change by working with legislators? And I'm struggling here.
Good question. Couple of ways to respond, I suppose. One is it would take probably a lot more thought than just what we would say off the top of our heads right now, and we could certainly have the conversation if you want to afterwards or tomorrow or whatever.
Yeah.
We'd be happy to have it. We have certainly seen a couple of ways to respond. One is there are ways to certainly take that local if that's something your organization can do. Some organizations are certainly not set up to be doing local organizing work. That's, it just might not be something that you do. I would also say that one of the things that we have started to do, in part just because we think this work we find it interesting, but because we think that there's probably a lot of interest in other environmental groups or public health groups, groups that work on toxics and other things, to try to bring this work to them, tell them the story of our work, take them through a democracy school if that's something of interest, to talk to them about how they can change their work. For example, in June, we'll be teaching a democracy school and speaking at the National Waterkeepers Alliance meeting in Seattle that they're going to have for their waterkeepers around the country. That's really local work that they do, but they bring them together in a national alliance like that to see about how they might shift their work. It's very, very difficult, I think, for especially national organizations who I myself have worked for. It's very, very difficult to think about them really shifting their mission. But I do think it can certainly be something that begins to get incorporated into the thinking, and if you can bring it down to the local level, could be very, very interesting. Do you want to add?
The town in Virginia that I spoke of, Halifax, it became the first in the country to pass a chemical trespass ordinance. We've been working with body burden issues, and in essence, that chemical trespass ordinance, which is up on our webpage, essentially holds the corporations liable for toxics that are found in people's bodies. So it's a chemical testing ordinance. It requires the municipality to do blood testing, and then there are footprints now for some of these chemicals that allow you to trace it back. So I think taking the end and then forcing it back into the process, but Halifax was the first town to pass that in the United States, and that happened
And I
last
do
month
know,
ago.
I mean, just based on the Halifax ordinance that was adopted in February, there are certainly that ordinance and the work that occurred there has been circulated among a lot of public health advocacy groups across the country. Maybe you've heard it. And so I think there is potentially a lot of interest in figuring out how to take that and operationalize it for them is something that we're certainly willing to have the conversation about, more than willing to have it with you, because it is a big shift in thinking about how the system works. And sometimes for some people, myself included, that meant stopping the work that I was doing. I think Michelle spoke of that as well. I'm inspired by that. But it's a very different way of thinking about the work. And so it takes a lot to make that change, I think.
So just to close down, Michelle is our democracy school person here, and we've committed to doing a democracy school here in Missoula. If there are enough people that want to take the class, it would be a full 3-day democracy school. And so she's the person to see, and she has some flyers as well if people are interested. Thank you, everybody, for coming.